There must be a decay. Otherwise, it'd be like perpetual motion, an impossibility. It would have to...
Hey everyone, this is Matt Scott, and I'm here and delighted to be talking to you about my work on this new record. This is, of course, Dr. Quandary's 2023 released Ghost Mint tape. It's a collection of beats that he'd been sitting on and just wanted to give him a good home sonically. I was super stoked to get the project for all kinds of reasons. Obviously, Quan is a pretty good friend of mine, and we've worked together a lot over the years. But the option to take material and just really focus on the master, less the mixing side, I was really excited to do because I know he produces such a high quality and kind of like deeply layered product, and usually already one with a pretty great mix on it. That, you know, it was just going to be a fun process for me. So a little housekeeping before we dive in, particularly because this is an analog hybrid workflow that we're going to be discussing. I want to make sure you have headphones on or you've got good monitors. I am running a feed directly out of Pro Tools, so you'll be hearing the audio as I hear it. You'll also be getting my mic through the Apollo console. And I think just to make sure you get the most out of the knob twisting I'm doing, definitely give yourself a listening environment that is more conducive to hearing things that can be a little subtle to the ear. Now, all that said, hybrid analog workflow. What exactly does that mean? Well, in the simplest of terms, and I'll show you right here, in our case, hybrid analog workflow means that I'm processing audio out of my laptop. It then carries it from the Apollo Twin into my Handsome Audio Zulu tape simulator. It leaves the Zulu and then goes back with that orange and yellow cabling into the inputs of 1 and 2 on my Apollo Twin, where I can process it with Apollo plugins before recording it back into Pro Tools. I wanted to use the Zulu for a couple of reasons. The first of which is in knowing with the bulk of these tunes I was going to get from Quandary, because the sample styles and the quality of the samples can be so disparate from one track to another, and it just kind of goes and is, you know, true to the nature of sample-based music in the first place. I wanted to make sure that I had something that was going to contribute to an overall sense of cohesion from one song to the next. So what is pretty common is using anything that has saturation, anything that has compression characteristics to some music through to apply it, so then it comes back into Pro Tools. It already feels like they've already been somewhere together, right? They're sharing a space that maybe those tracks didn't have separately. So I knew I wanted to go analog with that as much as anything because this is an incredible box and it's a lot of fun to use. It's very intuitive. And then contingent on that, once the tracks are back into Pro Tools, individually treating each track as needed as they then go into mastering and my mastering bus within Pro Tools. So technically it's a 3-step process, but I kind of think as far as analog workflow, it's analog first and then everything in digital. And then we can get into what that looks like in the digital realm when we get there. So now that I think you probably have a relative sense of what I'm talking about, let's go ahead and get into it. I'm just going to bring up this Pro Tools session right here. I'll give you a taste of where we're at. So a little housekeeping first and foremost. Again, as I said, I'm using the Apollo or the Universal Audio universe of plugins, as well as the ADA converter and kind of the thing I plug my microphones and my headphone into. You know, it's handling all of that. One of the features that one of the features that Universal Audio has is console. So console is quite literally, imagine you have a virtual mixing board in front of you at the time of input. You have faders, which are monitoring. They're not actually influencing what the output is into the system, but it's a process that happens before it hits Pro Tools. So I can actually, with low to zero latency, process a track before it hits Pro Tools to preserve the most natural version of itself. And if you've ever tried to use a computer that didn't have a lot of processing power, then you know what latency sounds like, and you know how it can wreak havoc on your signal flow. it makes it hard to hear, or you're hearing things in duplicate or things with delays. And things get complicated really quickly when you start to get in the mixing stage and you're applying plugins. And God forbid you're like me and you like to mix while you're tracking sometimes. But all to say, so everything's going into console, and you'll be seeing me pop up console and adjusting parameters as we go. So just know that on this side, this is my microphone that I'm using just to talk to you, and this is my input. If I ever raise it, it's because I want to make sure the mic is louder, probably over a track that we're listening to at the same time. And then over here, this is the Zulu return channel. So when I say that the Apollo leaves and goes to the Zulu for processing, and then it comes back in on 1 and 2, this is that 1 and 2. So we'll see this meter as we're getting signal processed, and it returns into the system. And then from this point, when I engage the corresponding channel within Pro Tools, that's how we can then record and actually get it in the system. So really think of this as just monitoring, but it's monitoring that we can also apply plugins to if we want to. So without further ado, let's just kind of get into it, right? If you've never worked with mastering before, here's what I'm going to do. So what I really want to talk about is kind of what the Zulu does, why I use the Zulu on all of these tracks as I'm mastering, right? And then I want to show you what it looks like when it's back in Pro Tools. So I'm going to spend less time on just like, well, what is mastering and how do you set it up to master? But real quick, know that all 9 tracks from Quandary have been assembled in one session together, and the start and end of each track line up exactly now. So that when we do a play from the beginning, we should ostensibly hear, or what we would hear if they were separated out and we were listening to it as an album or on a CD or whatever, right? So it's just, we want to make sure our listening environment is such that we're able to get a really accurate picture of what those transitions feel like and how they inform the track sequencing in the way it moves the listener as you move through the tune. That, in my opinion, and from the last couple of years of audio work that I've done, particularly when I have the chance to work more on mastering or kind of like the front to back of an album, your sequencing is everything. Your sequencing is what compels the person to start the next track. They could love that song, but if you really screw up the outro and the way that the fade breathes and moves into the next track, or maybe it doesn't because you left too much space, you pull the listener right out of it. So all to say, this is mastering 101, and the first thing I would typically do and did do in this session. Second to that is I want to get a sense of what the average loudness is across all of the tracks. So the idea being 2 things. 1, I need to know how loud those tracks are when I receive them, so I know how much headroom I have in order to master with. And B, to get a sense of, are all those tracks all hitting at that level when I receive it? If not, I usually want to work in either direction to get those tracks even starting from the same place, right? Starting from the same place means that when I'm working with mastering, my mastering limiters, my dynamic EQ, whatever, I know those will be reacting as hard from one track to the next. So just there's consistency in the mixing. It'll muddle everything up otherwise. So this is track 1, Seance Music. We'll just do a quick listen from the top just to tune your ear. You'll notice some of the time that I may raise a fader volume on a track, and that's just to make it a little louder for you, the listener. I'll always drop it back or explain to you why I did something after the fact, if not in the moment. But right now, I'm just going to bring it up to +4, just so that you're hearing it a little better, because you do have that direct feed out of Pro Tools.
Is there someone here now? If you're here now, show yourself. Make yourself known to us. We hear you. We're listening. Show yourself. Show yourself.
So we can hear the track starting to build, right? We're getting a sense that it's going to get louder, probably more dynamic. Drums will come in soon.
You mustn't go yet. Don't break the circle.
That's a great drum groove. So right out of the gate, if I zoom in a little on this track, you'll see that even visually, this track kind of stays at this volume through the duration. This is as loud as the track gets. So while I'm on this section, I'm going to bring up this little meter that lives on my master bus just to see what we're working with. I'm going to go ahead and bring this volume back down to 0 just so that it's not influencing the way this meter reacts. but you can see our peak, -9, -10. So he's giving us a dynamic range of almost 10 dB that we can bring things up and kind of play with limiters and compressors to kind of add more nuance to the sound, which is rad. Also noticing LUFS, so loudness units full scale. LUFS are another way of measuring relative loudness and volume, much like dB is. The distinction being that LUFS is actually integrated. It's both actual loudness and perceived loudness. So there's a phenomenon when listening to music to where things can feel louder than they are based on your EQing decisions, how you're hyping frequencies or ducking frequencies. And LUFS takes all that into consideration. LUFS also happens to be the standard of most in the audio industry at this point. I mean, if you've watched any podcasts about audio, you've heard it discussed recently. If for no other reason than the standards which companies like Spotify or Apple Music set for how they wish to receive their audio from you. The idea being that they all have their own algorithm for how they normalize your music. And if you submit it at -14 LUFS to them on their end, they'll probably make the least amount of shifting or altering or normalizing your sound, just so that when you're on a playlist and it jumps from you to Beyonce, you're somewhere in the stratosphere of the same volume as one another, right? So anyway, so we know now Kyle put us in a great place. We're at -10. Our LUFS are anywhere 22.9 to I think 25. I was looking at it earlier. And I'm not doing this for you now, but also know that I went through every one of these tracks and I just took a little notebook and I jotted down -9, 23 LUFS, -8.5 peak, 24 LUFS, whatever. Just so that if I felt like out of the gate I needed to make any adjustments to these tracks individually, just so that they're all kind of hitting the master bus at the same relative volume or the same relative loudness, I could do that. So in the case right here with this track, you'll see if you're looking at the clip gain, I added a little less than 1 decibel of gain to it. And that was, it was probably initially hitting a little soft and I just wanted to bring it up. But I digress. Let's jump back to this first track real quick. So again, my approach in this analog hybrid realm was I want to use analog on all of the tracks to take the ambience collectively and give it some unity, so that when I had it back in the digital realm, it really was just a matter of some fine tuning, but I was using the tape effect and the Zulu to really get the saturation, the compression, the EQ characteristics that now exist on all these tracks overall. There's endless approaches to how you master. I just decided to go this route because I knew, Quandary's music calls for vibe. And I can't say that this box is anything short of vibey. I mean, that's what the Zulu is kind of for. You get that classic tape sound, but then you kind of have a passive EQ and compressor at the same time. It's pretty rad. But so idea being, once it gets out of Zulu, it re-enters the digital realm through Apollo. I can treat it with Apollo. Apollo has effects that are basically zero or almost no latency effects that you can apply prior to your track entering Pro Tools. So think of it as a digital stage emulating the analog stage, right? Before it then goes full digital back through your ADA converters. In this case, I did actually use a compressor on every track out of the Zulu compressing then before it came back into Pro Tools, just to add a little control. And I'll show what that looked like in a minute. But what I'm going to do right now is set up video on my phone so that we can actually get a clearer sense of how this Zulu works and what it's doing. And you'll actually hear in real time how we're influencing this track, okay? So what I'm going to do first and foremost is on the track Seance Music, I'm going to go to my outputs and I'm going to route the output, which is the physical output on my Apollo, to send out to the inputs of the Zulu. Now that I've done that, when we listen back, particularly through console, we'll now see console metering, which is the return of that Zulu and everything we're affecting it with. So a few things to know too. I'm going to jump over here and I'll show you some video of the Zulu that I'll be using here. Some things you should know about the Zulu is that because we are emulating tape, essentially tape likes to get hit harder with signal, right? We like the impact that tape has when it's being pushed a little bit more and the signal's really imprinting on those heads and, you know, into the tape itself. So one thing we might typically do is I'm going to hit play right now and you're going to hear Zulu, but it's probably going to be a little soft, okay? So again, we can hear some sound right now, but if we look at console, look at how low we're returning, which means that we're not really hearing the saturation so much because, again, given Zulu is emulating tape, if you hit it harder, the tape's going to have more of a colored signal. So we're actually just going to go to Seance Music and we're going to boost it. We'll say 6 decibels.
You mustn't go yet.
And now on this side, within console, you can see we're now hitting at least whatever that is, minus 20 or there in the park, whereas we were at like minus 35 before. So with the Zulu, we have a series of knobs for twisting, and those knobs all do very specific things, which I will attempt to break down for you real quick. Headroom, you have 3 levels of headroom. Think of it as how hard can signal hit the tape machine before it starts to degrade. And moving from low to high. Low means it's going to start to break up pretty quickly and you'll hear it saturate and kind of get woolly faster. Pro, I mean, think of it this way, low, medium, high, right? High means the most transparency, the least amount of coloration. Low means the most. Pro is a balance of the two. For this record, I think I kept them both on high. I wasn't trying to create a ton new wool in Quan's sound. I wasn't trying to blow it out. I just wanted to create a color palette for each track that when we get back into Pro Tools feels like it's already closer to being a finished record and they've got that sonic imprint. Bias and enhance, these two work together. And my understanding from the material from the manufacturer, from Handsome Audio, is that bias, these directly impact the EQ curve and the overall EQing, like the amount of, it's really like a balance from low to high, like how much bass and how much high end. That gets steeper as you go. Minus means less, plus means more, but it reacts directly with these enhance knobs, which do a pretty wild thing too. And what enhance is by itself is actually resonant. It's like a resonant filter, as well as a copy of the unaffected audio that are then summed together. And it has this effect of creating really beautiful saturation and harmonics while also bringing out top end and bottom, like knock frequencies. For our purposes too, enhance, for all that it does, it also has a tendency to make things louder quickly. You'll see as I crank the enhance knob and really as you listen, how many jumps in gain we get with every crank I take on here. And then after that, 2 more features. So deck, if you look up real close here, deck, low, pro, high, and off. So deck indicates the style of machine that it is emulating. Pro being, I believe, a Japanese, like Nakamichi 80s style hi-fi, but still kind of colored tape. High being a Studer and low being cassette deck quality. So those have dramatic implications as far as deck goes. Last but not least, I'll wedge behind here. I'm not really going to try and get too close. If you see those little black sliders on either side, again, in a stereo pair, those black sliders indicate the tape style. So if you've ever heard of like GP9 as mastering grade tape, these are 4 different gradients of styles of tape that each have their own color and palette. And you can just flick the switch to dial through which one makes the most sense for you. In this case, I went with, I think, the GP9 equivalent. Again, I really wasn't looking to add too much color because Quan has already imbued it with so much of its own identity. I just really wanted to make sure that as we go, I was giving it a fair shake. So one last thing to know too, this is a stereo unit, the Zulu. One suggestion I would strongly advise is that you make your knob moves together, because of the nature of something like this, and when you're trying to work, especially in a mastering context, with stereo, you risk throwing off the stereo spectrum, among other things, if you're physically manipulating volume on one side and not another, and you're not really paying attention to it, but also inherent phase issues that can creep up if you're not really keeping them unified. All that to say, too, if you were to use this as in a mix situation, and this was for your guitar and this was for your bass guitar, that's not a stereo, that's two monos. Go nuts. Print them how you want to and use this as you see fit. But in my case, I'm always going to be making moves that look like they're happening in the same direction, the same number of clicks, because I want to preserve the stereo image and the stereo field that Quan has created to the best of my ability. So again, when I hit play, you're listening to the sound actually coming out of the Zulu, okay? And I'm going to twist some knobs, and really all I'm looking for, and I'll talk to you about it as I go, is does it sound balanced? Does it have a little more mojo to it? Do I like the sounds? Do I find them pleasing? All I'm trying to do is kind of adhere to my own sensibilities, because at the time that they're back in Pro Tools, I know I can adjust them as I need to all over again in the digital realm. This is really just to kind of create a space that I can share across all the tracks and find that sweet spot. I will also say, too, it is not necessarily the case that I kept one Zulu parameter throughout. I did adjust from one track to the next in slight steps. You know, I may move the bias 2 clicks in one direction or another, but just really trying to always play to the song's interest. Again, my last stage in my mastering is a master bus that everything is going to hit in the exact same way. Now I still have a little more flexibility if I feel like something needs a little zhuzh, but I'm gonna hit spacebar. We'll listen real quick. I'll talk at you a little bit more. All right.
All of you, you mustn't go yet. Don't break the
So one other thing I'm going to do here real quick. If we're looking back in console right now and you see that I'm still hitting at -18, one thing you can do is you just fed it back into a preamp, right, at the time that came back into Apollo. So this is preamp gain at line level. So give yourself a little bit more. 21 dB. You now see we're hitting pretty much all in the green, but -9, give or take, on the meters there in console. All right, jumping back over here real quick. Enhance. Check out what a click does. A little more open top. Some of the decay and the reverb seems to pop out more and last a little longer. In the other direction, if I pull enhance way back, it's just a darker sound overall. I'll move that forward again. For our purposes, this is what low headroom sounds like. High headroom. Not too much of a difference, and that's because I'm really not hitting this that hard. Again, I'm really just trying to kiss it. I'm not trying to like brutalize the
Will you
track.
let me worry about that? Now, come on, please go. Will you go? Now, come on, get out of here,
If we jump back to bias,
all of you,
with these enhanced
you
settings
mustn't
where I
go
left
yet.
them,
Don't break the circle.
that makes some clicks here. Here's the top open a little bit when I really had it cranked. Let's go 2 more steps. actually going to pull. I like the way there was some mid scoop when I had hands pulled back on that things here. Play the bias again. Nothing wrong with that, right? Again, it's subtle, but
All of you, Jonas. You mustn't go.
More subtlety in audio is never going to hurt anyone.
Circle.
I mean, it's those 100 subtle moves that lend themselves to finding that record of your dreams. And your favorite albums were made out of 1,000 very subtle, smart decisions, I guarantee you. No one on the engineering side is brazen. There's just not room for it. And if there was, it's, you know, yeah, thrash metal with a couple 57s, like, there's a place for that too, but that's not our trajectory here. So I'm going to go back over to the Apollo console now. And you'll notice that I have a plugin that isn't currently active. With every one of these tracks, Quandary, I tried to have the Zulu hitting back on its return around -9, pretty close to the place that it was sent out from. And then I had a bus compressor, specifically the SSLG series. I think it's a 4000 series bus compressor. The idea with this is that, again, much like the Zulu, with its own EQ and compression characteristics that it's adding in a pseudo tape style, a little extra kiss from this SSL
The circle.
affords us a couple more decibels or even a half decibel of compression on the way in. And then beyond that, a little bit of the pump and a little bit of the kind of the, what they say, the glue characteristics. Yeah. The way it's just a brilliantly executed compressor that really excels on hip-hop music, beat-oriented music, R&B music, and it's been used in a million records to achieve a really great product, kind of sitting as one of the last elements on your mix bus or even on your master bus. In this case, we'll call this our mix bus because we're feeding from the Zulu into this compressor back into Pro Tools to complete the mastering. So we'll still say mix bus for now. Fuck it.
All of you, Jonas.
My intention here, and in general with this unit, is that I want the thresholds to look like it's barely reacting, even with the thumpiest kick. As you can see, right out of the gate, we're maybe getting 2 dB of compression that is mostly reacting to the kick drum sound and very little else. But you can't really hear it yet, right? If anything, it's making those kicks quieter. So next step in the game, we've got what? We said 2.5 dB of compression. So let's make up gain. They should be about the same loudness. Out. In. Out. Out. Pretty amazing. Like right out of the gate, you hear, again, compressors really influence reverb tails and the way reverb maintains presence in your mix and can do some really amazing things if you're careful about it. In this case, that's the thing I hear first and foremost. It kind of tightens up the snare. The relationship between the kick and the snare seem to come closer together. The reverb actually seems to poke out more than it did before in a really pleasing way that adds some width and some additional space to the track. And then in thinking about the other parameters, because this is a pretty simple compressor, I mean, you know, what you're looking at is a physical compressor inside a mixing board. They just did a point-to-point digital emulation of. But it looks simple because it's just a, you know, center of your console little compressor, grab and go and get on with your day. It's not some glorious untold piece of technology. It's fairly utilitarian. But so what you're looking at now are the parameters I would typically use for, I would say, a very soft treatment. When I'm more focused on it, just kind of tightening things and less of it being coloring or pumping, because you can really create a pretty pumpy, dynamic kind of duct bass or kick sound with this too, and it's really brilliant and effective for that as a compressor, but it's just not the application. So again, all I'm doing is I'm making the attack very slow, 30 milliseconds, so that it's really just it's letting the transient through. It's really just grabbing what's left in your from what you're saying is too loud threshold and softening that blow. I'm also keeping the ratio really soft, so a 2-to-1 ratio. So keeping the ratio low, and then a release time. I usually time the release to the music. So your biggest tell is you can actually look at the physical metering if you have the physical meter or the digital metering. And depending on how quickly that needle relaxes and goes back to zero, applying no compression, you can actually, with your release, these are fixed release times, but you can have some control and kind of feel like the compressor breathes at the tempo of the music. And when you do that and you play with that threshold just right, that's where your magic happens, friends. That's where they talk about compressors having these incredible qualities to shape tone and be like, yeah, it's just you turn this compressor on and it's just better. Well, yeah, that may be true, but it has to do with timing, right? It's all about how your source audio or your music is influencing this compressor, and how are you developing the relationship between the two to make sure this compressor really listens and reacts musically to what you're doing. So let's bring it back in, and I'm going to set the release time to very slow, and then I'll bring it to 0.3. And you're going to see the needles start to follow the music more closely. Slow, it's going to feel like it just kind of waxes. It takes its time getting back to zero. It sounds too fast. It almost sounds like the compressor doesn't have a chance to do its thing. But take a listen, see if you can hear exactly what that release time is doing. Love this bass line. So
You
good.
mustn't go yet. Don't break the circle.
Again, 1.2 second release. You can see that the needle never even has a chance to get back to zero, right? It's always in compression because it's so slow that it doesn't have a chance to get that back to zero before it's triggered again by what we've had our threshold set at. So let's go to 0.6 seconds. Kick certainly started to come to life a little bit. But again, it still feels slow, and the needle's telling you it's slow. 0.3. The track suddenly gets to breathe, right? It's not like it's holding on to that compressor for too long. It's really amazing. And then if you pull it out, so also one thing I'll say, see where my mouse is? This is our master meter from our console. So theoretically, when I bring the compressor in and out,
The circle has been broken, and
you'll
that
be
can
able to
cause
see
fearful
if
consequences.
the compressor is just making the track louder so we think it sounds
Get
louder,
out of here, please.
or if it's actually doing some juju. So right now, with our compressor in, again, peaks are right around -9. This is actually with it out, and this is in. Peaks are actually slightly below -9 overall. Perceived loudness wise, they're either right on par with each other with the compressor inserted or out, or slightly quieter. But to my ear, there's much more impact with the compressor in. Like, it's a clearly audible difference. You can just hear things start to come to life, and it dances a little bit. And that's what you want. That's what you want from a bus compressor. The best case Ontario with a bus compressor is you set it up exactly how you see it here, adjust the threshold to taste, maybe play with release time if you're working with a real slow ballad or whatever the case may be, but listen to it. listen for the music to suddenly take on that quality that feels like it's growing shoulders and they're pulsing. That's how you know you're on the right track. So let's say, for our purposes, that we're pretty stoked with this. So we've got a sound that we're happy with Zulu. We've got a sound that we're really happy with within console with our bus compressor. And now we're ready to get this stuff back into Pro Tools, right? So here's what we do. Command-Shift-N, create a new stereo track, hit enter. We'll go ahead and name this Seance Zulu Return, because this is the return from Zulu being reprinted into Pro Tools. And then our interface, which is B mic lines 1 and 2. Now, when I hit the number 3 on the keypad, we'll start actually recording all of this with those effects printed to a new track. Here goes.
Is there someone here now? If you're here now, show yourself.
And what's cool about this in this process too is because we're incorporating hardware in the same way you'd have to create automation with a plugin, our automation is our hands, right? If I decided halfway through a song I wanted to change where a hand sat with Zulu, I could just grab it, and it's now printing that into Pro Tools, just like a guitar solo. I think that's one of the things people lose in the mixing game, especially when you do everything in blocks, is that you can be really performative. There is a way and an approach to doing this that makes you as active a participant even in a physical way as the musicians themselves. And by incorporating some of that hardware, your level of engagement just switches. It's no longer the same conversation. And it opens up a world of opportunities. And anything you can do to stay engaged is my rule of thumb. And if it happens to sound half as good as the Zulu does, then you're really winning, right? So you see the example. This was our source audio. This is our processed audio, right? And we can listen to the processed audio real quick and hear exactly what's going on. Verify that we're happy and content. So good. Metering all looks great.
You mustn't go yet.
We're actually, you can see from the source track to the new one, we're actually coming in a little quieter, which is just fine. We've got plenty of ways to make use of quiet between now and the end product. But now that we're in, what I'm going to share with you is actually the process track that I actually used for the session that used more or less this exact setup. It was this Zulu roughly with these parameters, followed by that exact setup with the SSL bus compressor, okay? So now I'm going to go ahead and mute out our original track, and now we're just working with the processed track. So again, to refresh for your ear with the process track. And again, this is one I processed actually for the session itself. There we are. Really sounds great. But to my ear, and in particular at the time that I started working with the processed audio, it was like, it sounds great, but I still feel like there is room to get a little more top end out of this thing and to open it up. It sounds a little tight, particularly I think in some way I was thinking, you know, the snare, the rim shots, they're there. This is the original. They have an identity. But it almost sounds like they're in a closet. Like the snare seems like it's talking to you from another room. So I brought up this EQ 1081 Neve clone that T-Rax makes, which just is super buttery. It's awesome. Highly recommend it. And I played around with the EQ until I found what felt like a sweet spot. In this case, 3.3K. And here in the top end, 4.7. I gave them both a boost, a little over a decibel. And listen to what happens with the identity of that snare drum. Ready? Out. In. It's like in that EQ, like within those two bands, it totally added a 3D or like a three-dimensional quality once engaged. That was just, it was even better than I had anticipated, to be quite honest with you. I didn't necessarily expect that it was going to sound and open it up as much as it did. And a lot of that is just those EQ bands. But honestly, if you've ever used the physical or even physical clones of the Neve EQs, and I've got 84s, 81s, and 73s, those EQs just sound awesome, man. They really saturate beautifully, and they have a dimensionality to them that you kind of can't fake the funk with. It's really cool that we're at a point where digital technology can do those emulations so well. But this has become kind of a jack of all trades EQ when I just feel like I need a little bit more, but I want it to have that Neve punch. It usually ends up on a drum boss, if I'm being honest. That's, I'll use other EQs for guitars and basses or whatnot, but on drums and with a snare, there's just no substitute for what Neve can do. 73, 81, 84, or otherwise. So we've got that in the mix now, and now to my ear, we're really at this place of just bubbling. There's so much energy. And to me, that kind of put us in a good place to actually enter the master bus with any final footnotes. Again, I created a master bus that it was more like I create a static master bus, and then everything I mix into it. So the master stays static, but I have tertiary control and secondary control at input with the plugins themselves and the tracks themselves. The only other thing I did, and Kyle was super cool about this, anytime I had the inclination to be like, boy, I feel like this fade out could have some weird effect wash. And effects usually aren't what they can be, but they're often not in the mastering engineer's realm. That's usually something that a producer or a mix engineer sends to you with the effects already printed. But because it was a beat tape, and I know that Quan wanted to work in the direction of creating like a synergy and a real flow from one to another, I played around with some different effects. On this track, the outro, I actually used Soundtoys Microshift, which is probably one of my favorite plugins. I use it everywhere. It is so flexible for adding dimension and weird, interesting phase, and it's just kind of remarkable what it does. So if I click over here into Microshift, what I did is I found parameters I liked. I basically had the delay and detune maxed out. So if you're not familiar with what Microshift does, it's kind of riffing on, and I don't know if it's a direct clone or if it's a derivative of, but either way, Eventide H9000, which is like a harmonizer that also has all these interesting delay artifacts and kind of soundscapes you can tweak. Within that, and in the Eventide realm of kind of advanced widening tools and just sound manipulation tools, is one that basically takes your audio, it doubles it, it spreads it out, and then with subtle detuning of your secondary or even third level source, in addition to playing with the amount of delay and how tight or loose those tracks are from one another, in the mix, it creates an incredible amount of space. And you can take something that's very focused and centered, and suddenly it's out of the room entirely. It's so far on either side of your ears. It's awesome. And it's really cool for creating subtle or not so subtle effects and shifts in energy in a track. I use it and bury it, and I'll use it in automation, and it almost adds an otherworldly, undescribable quality. So all I did here, and you're now looking at this automation, is I set up a situation where I was automating the mix to flow from dry to wet and back again on the outro. We'll listen to it in, we'll listen to it out. You'll see what's up.
You don't understand. The circle has been broken, and that can cause fearful consequences.
Will you let me worry about that? Come on, please go. Will you go? Now, come on, get out of here, please.
We must form the circle again.
So you heard that, right? That was an obvious. I mean, it sounds like a phaser. Sounds like a phaser and then hard panner happening at the same time. So I just wanted that to create some energy and, create some additional motion in the track from the outro, and also to help it differentiate from what would become the intro to the second track. And in this case too, just so you can hear what it actually does, I'm going to put it in bypass, and we'll listen back for a second, and you'll hear how much more in one plane, I guess is the only way to describe it. the sounds relative to the automation I inserted.
You don't understand. The circle has been broken, and that can cause fearful consequences.
Will you let me worry about that? Now, come on,
Crazy,
please
right?
go. Will you go? Now, come on, get out of here, please.
We must form the circle again.
So yeah, on this cut, the first on the record, really all I did as far as pre-treatment before the master bus was a little bit of EQ when it came back, and then I kissed it with an effect to kind of blend into the next section. So again, knowing that my target for all of this music, I was like optimistically hoping that I could have each track hitting around minus 10.7 LUFS. I then set up a master bus and then worked with the master bus against all those tracks once I had them in that relative space where I felt like they were kind of knocking, just to play with the limiters and sometimes the clip gain or the physical fader on each of those tracks until they were all in that 10.7 territory, at which point I knew I was in a pretty good place. So what I'm going to do next, the only thing I have on mastering other than different metering is Ozone. And I say only, but what you should know about Ozone is that it's 1,000 plugins you can line up as modules next to each other if you've ever used it before. It's scary, awesome stuff. But bringing it back in here with Ozone, I have a matte master start, which is just a composite template I've developed over the last couple of years of using Ozone, of some plugins that are going to be my go-tos. I start with them all out. I bring them in. I adjust EQ. I adjust first level multiband limiting and compression. I then use a maximizer that I keep pretty low, like it's not limiting much, as a place to start, and then a second limiter will I really drive it home and get the most juice or hit the target that I'm shooting with the vintage limiter. But I'm going to bring it back in real quick. So now Ozone is on, and I'm just going to talk through each of these modules and what my application and function was. So I'm going to go ahead and bring output volume down just to make it easier to talk over. EQ, really tried not to do too much. Most of the EQing I did on the individual tracks themselves, either with the Zulu or at the time that they, hit Protools again and I treated them like I did with that 81 EQ. So this is just like a general feng shuang pattern I came up with, which doesn't impact the lows at all. Low mids, just a little bit. A little more of that low mid. If it was a male vocalist, I'd say chest voice, but kind of like that section that sometimes gets lost and too much mid gets scooped out in tracks. Not to say that was the case here, but in this case, the music had handled it overall. A little juice around 3K, and again, when I say little, if you're looking at the metering on the side, this is 2 decibels of gain at its peak.
Get out of here, please.
We must form the circle
So here,
again.
we're looking at 0.9 dB boost of presence.
I don't know about you,
Around
but I got a
3K
funny
with a pretty
feeling
gentle
in
slope.
there. Yeah, so did I.
And then on the top,
I don't believe in ghosts.
15K
I'll
and
tell you
above,
this, for my money, you did
a
the right
healthy
thing
increase,
getting
but
out
at a relative taper. Again, and in knowing that through the tape mastering process and the Zulu process, I'd actually kind of, in a way, done some soft shelving and softening of those upper frequencies. This is just a way now to bring some of it back, but bring it back unified all at once by having it applied to each of those individual tracks I'm mastering, right? So that's phase one, generally EQing. Second step, run it back again. Multi-band compressor. Really, again, it doesn't need to do much. There's still so much dynamics and the EQ is so cleaned up from what, frankly, Quan had sent me initially. It didn't need much. But you can see in our low mid band compressor set at minus 15 threshold. I mean, 0.3 dB of compression in those low mids, just enough to soften ever so slightly. but you can see where it's at worst is actually the low mid, so 1 to like 150 in that ballpark. Upper mids, not impacted at all in general. Top, next to nothing. Lows, really next to nothing. And that's this track. Obviously, track to track, some of these work a little harder based on the band. I don't think I ever made an adjustment of the band width that these were imprinted in. I kind of just set it to a place that sounded good, ignored the meters, and moved on. That's one thing I would stress for anyone who's getting into mastering. Meters don't lie, but meters don't pay the bills. Your ears pay the bills. Your intuitiveness as a mix engineer or mastering engineer pays the bills. The trust that you create for a client by having ears that are impeccable, well-tuned, and really know how to listen, that's what you want. So again, meters don't show much here. Some tracks they showed more, but my goal was really just to listen to each track. If it felt like dynamics were suffering, then I'd address it. But I just listened to all tracks in succession with these, made slight adjustments till it seemed like trouble spots disappeared or disintegrated, and moved on. On to the fun stuff where we start to get gain. Our maximizer off. You're going to hear a huge jump. You may not even be able to hear my voice in a second. Boom, chowdy. So I chose to use the IRC2, which is its release control setting that says sharp limiting to preserve peaks. There really weren't many peaks, so not much limiting really needed to take place. Again, 0.3. But it manages to do it while getting a significant boost in gain. And I just kept my ceiling at -1 because again at this point I still wasn't in danger of peaking out. At least as I listened with my ears. And then a final blast to get to our -10.7 with a vintage limiter set into tube mode.
You don't understand.
Really important to know with Ozone, if you're using the vintage limiter setting, modern tube and analog as modes sound like foreign planets, man. They couldn't be more different from each other. To me, tube, I mean, true to what a tube, physical cathode tube, or, you know, the tube that you have inserted into your power amp stage of your Marshall head. It adds harmonics, it adds saturation, it adds a lot of color, but it can really, really work in your favor if you hit it if you don't hit it too hard. It adds a fullness with the harmonics that it adds that just kind of can be over the top yummy. Analog, which I'm assuming is probably more like a FET style compressor or something. Beautiful sounding. To my ear, analog is a little, it's round, but thin in a way that tube isn't. And sometimes you just want what a tube limiter can provide in terms of just the overall chewiness of your end product. And then last but not least, modern tends to have a really soothing, more hyped high end, because I don't think the limiter is ducking as much in that range. Very snappy, very controlled, and all three are great, and I'll use them on, I mean, shit, some albums I'll use all three on an album in a mastering stage, just what the tracks deserve. But in this one, because I'd pre-treated every track coming in and they really all kind of had a similar vibe by the time I got to my master bus, I was able to leave it in tube and satisfy all three. But we'll listen back and I'll actually go analog, tube, and modern so you can hear the way that those different limiters play with our source audio. Again, tube, fat, hyped, out, in, move to analog. Analog is even more hyped, but to the point of it being a little taxing. And then modern. Yeah, Tube just has a dusty quality to it that I really felt like worked for these body of songs. Honestly, I could have used as the very last step in the mastering chain. I could have used any of these, and if I'd done all 9 tracks through it, it would have sounded great. No one would know but me. But on that day, I chose Tube because I like the harmonic color it added, and I stuck with it. Now, one last thing. So I'm only going to do this track for you, and we'll call it a day, and maybe I'll come back to other tracks and give you a play-by-play, but there was plenty discussed here to keep you busy for a minute. Last thing I'll do, again, is now that I have my mastering where I want it, I'm telling you I know it's at a good level left-wise, but I'll actually show you. If we bring up Insight again. Bus a little bit, you guys. I brought it down so I didn't have to talk so loud. So now you're seeing, now that I actually brought the master bus back to 0, you're seeing the integrated loudness creeping towards 10.7, which sure enough, if we were to let it play out through the whole track, you'd see that. That's where we're finally hitting. And again, it's that same process with each track as I just kind of fine tune either through clip gain or through individual plugins and effects chains, how to make sure they're all really living in that one space and have that identity at the time that we reach our finished product. And in this case, it was 5.5 hours later, and I think I worked through this tune. I had a lot of fun mastering this record, and a lot of that was because Quan allowed me to be as free as I wanted to with how I approached it. So props to him for trusting an engineer to take good care of his music and to give him a product he'd be happy with. I would love to do this for you. I would love to do this for your friend's band, aspiring hip-hop artists. I would also love to walk you through what my process was for this, but relative to your own music and where you want to head. If you're an aspiring engineer and you want to get more out of it, I'm totally down to talk. Hit me up on Instagram, ScottSoundVD, my website, scottsound.studio, my personal email, matt@scottsound.studio, and we can keep the conversation going in all directions. Was this cool for you? Did you enjoy the process of me prattling on about what it actually looks like to be a mastering engineer and to deliver a finished product? If so, let me know. Let me know in the comments. Let's find a path to intersect. I'm still kind of getting my feet wet in terms of doing this job full time as a mixing engineer, as a mastering engineer. And I say that mainly because it takes time to build a client base. But if you like what you heard and you want to work together, I'm very approachable. I deliver work quickly, and I'm generally happy to help. So be in touch when you can. That'll conclude this round of mastering for today. But again, more to come, to be determined by you, the listening and appreciative viewer. All right, be well, do good work. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.
Otherwise, it'd be like perpetual motion and impossibility.